The protagonist was shocked to receive a letter from someone who had been dead for decades. The letter, signed by a notorious bank robber, claimed that he needed help retrieving gold. The postmark showed it had been sent only a day before, which made no sense, given that the sender had been killed in 1933. While the protagonist didn't believe in ghosts sending mail, the mention of gold was enough to spark curiosity. The following morning, another letter arrived, this time hinting at a job worth millions. Though the protagonist wasn't in need of money, the amount was tempting. Then, just 2 days later, an email arrived from the same supposed sender, suggesting that the protagonist join a gang. Amused, the protagonist jokingly responded, dismissing the idea. Soon after, the phone rang. It was a familiar voice, someone who had once been in danger while working on a case for the protagonist. She needed a favor. Years ago, while researching honeybee deaths, she had been shot at, and the protagonist had stepped in to help. Feeling indebted, the protagonist readily agreed to meet her. As the conversation continued, it became clear that the strange messages had been a setup. The woman's boyfriend had orchestrated them to spark the protagonist's interest. The boyfriend, a literature student, believed the tactic would work, and he had been right. The protagonist was intrigued and agreed to a meeting, eager to uncover what this was all about. They arranged to meet at a familiar coffee house near the university. As the protagonist arrived, parking near an old church that had changed hands over the years, there was a sense that something unusual was about to unfold. The worn-out blue SUV sat across the street, parked with a clear view of the house. 2 men sat inside, their presence almost unnoticed until the driver flicked out a cigarette butt, joining the pile of others on the ground. Judging by the number of discarded cigarettes, they had been there for at least 30 minutes. Inside, the woman sat at the same table as before, appearing unchanged in her surroundings, but she herself was different. 2 years ago, she had hidden behind thick glasses, loose clothing, and an awkward hairstyle. Now, her red hair framed her face, and her outfit accentuated her confidence. As soon as she saw the protagonist, she jumped up with excitement, laughing as they embraced. The protagonist complimented her appearance, making her smile warmly. Beside her, a man stood up to introduce himself. His voice carried a rehearsed tone, as if he enjoyed repeating his name. His presence was unremarkable, average height, slightly overweight with forgettable features. The protagonist couldn't help but wonder what the woman saw in him. Still, they took a seat, and the table held only empty mugs and a plate dusted with powdered sugar. Curious about their stay, the protagonist asked how long they had been there. The woman casually estimated 30 minutes, but the man corrected her with exact precision, 42 minutes. His need for accuracy was almost amusing. The protagonist felt the pieces connecting. His timing matched the chain smoker outside. When asked what was going on, the man offered to get a drink. He listed an array of options, but the protagonist simply asked for black coffee. His reaction was one of mild disbelief before heading to the counter. Left alone for a moment, the protagonist and the woman shared a warm exchange. She squeezed the protagonist's hand, expressing how happy she was to see them. She spoke about her studies, revealing she was close to earning her PhD. The man soon returned with coffee, taking his seat as the conversation continued. He seemed uneasy about the protagonist's closeness with the woman, but said nothing. However, his patience were thin. With a sudden burst of energy, he announced that there were things they needed to discuss. The woman confirmed it, her tone serious. She finally got to the point. They needed the protagonist's help. But before she could say more, the man quickly corrected her. Not need, he insisted, glaring at her as if she had exposed too much. She shrugged, unconcerned, questioning why else they would have called. His frustration was evident, but he pressed on, ignoring the distraction. He then asked if the protagonist knew about a man named Jelly Nash. When they confirmed, he began recounting a tale as if reading from a history book. Jelly Nash had been a notorious bank robber in the 1920s and 30s. His real name was Frank Nash, and he had grown up in Oklahoma after losing his mother at a young age. The protagonist quickly realized the man wasn't interested in whether they already knew this information. He had a story to tell, and nothing was going to stop him from telling it. The conversation grew more intense as the discussion turned to a legendary heist. The man leading the conversation remained unfazed by the impatience of his listener, continuing with his detailed account. He described how a notorious thief had meticulously planned his robberies, studying banks for hours, mapping out their layouts, and timing his heists with precision. Each operation had a strict time limit. Once it was up, he and his gang left, regardless of how much they had taken. The true purpose of the conversation was soon revealed. In 1933, at exactly 9 a.m. on June 8th, a daring thief stole 32 gold bars from a South Dakota bank. That gold, valued at an astonishing sum in today's market, had never been recovered. The revelation left the listener stunned. As the weight of the information sank in, the speaker continued, explaining that the stolen gold had been en route to a secure bank in Minneapolis, meant to be safeguarded. The atmosphere grew tense as the historical context of gold ownership laws was discussed. Before the changes introduced in 1933, gold circulated freely as currency, but new laws had criminalized private ownership, forcing citizens to trade their gold for other forms of money. The government, scrambling for secure storage, had to send the gold to various locations, including reserve banks and mints. The man detailed how the cunning thief must have learned about the shipment, using his vast network of informants. The robbery had been widely reported at the time, but oddly enough, only the stolen cash had been consistently mentioned in newspapers. The gold had seemingly vanished from public records, raising suspicions. The listener, skeptical, suggested that the lack of reporting might have been an error, but the man was prepared. He had used official channels to access classified government files, confirming that the gold theft had indeed happened. The authorities at the time had deliberately hidden the truth. The reasoning behind the cover-up was a matter of speculation. Banks had been struggling, with customers panicking and withdrawing their money. Some banks had gone to extreme lengths to prove their solvency, stacking cash in plain sight to reassure depositors. The fear was that news of the stolen gold could spark even greater financial chaos. Additionally, political factors played a role. A powerful leader had resisted calls for a bank holiday, fearing the economic impact. However, if the theft had been widely known, public pressure might have forced him to take drastic action. There were whispers that he had helped suppress the news to maintain control. As the conversation unfolded, it became clear that this was more than just a story. It was a mystery buried in history, a secret that could change everything if the missing gold was ever found. The conversation continued with a discussion about an old bank robbery, revealing details about a daring heist carried out by a notorious criminal. The protagonist listened as the story unfolded, learning that the bank was robbed at exactly 9 a.m., right after it opened to the public. The distance from the town where the crime took place to the city where the suspect was later spotted was significant, making it almost impossible for him to have arrived so quickly in 1933. Yet, by 9 p.m. that same day, he was seen enjoying himself at a popular nightclub with his wife and an architect couple. Newspapers at the time were obsessed with criminals, treating them like celebrities, and this event was widely reported. It was believed that the criminal fled straight to the city after the heist, which made sense given the city's long-standing reputation as a haven for criminals. For nearly 30 years, authorities had allowed gangsters to move freely as long as they didn't commit crimes within the city limits. This corrupt system, known as the O'Connor system, protected criminals from outside law enforcement. However, the protagonist already knew all of this, cutting off the explanation impatiently. The discussion then turned to the movements of the robber and his wife after the crime. They were found spending time with other well-known criminals before leaving suddenly. However, it was noted that he did not have the stolen gold with him when he was later caught by federal agents. One of the speakers suggested that the criminal was a different kind of thief, one who wouldn't have risked his wife's safety by carrying both her and the stolen gold together. This theory was further supported by the fact that the gold was never found on him when he was arrested. The protagonist then questioned whether the stolen gold could still be hidden somewhere in the city. It was revealed that despite years of searching, no one was ever arrested for the crime, and the gold was never recovered. Even the Treasury Department had no solid evidence tying the man directly to the heist, as the thieves had worn masks. When asked how they knew he was responsible, the explanation given was that the way the crime was executed perfectly matched his style: the use of explosives, the swift getaway, and the entire approach. Still skeptical, the protagonist pointed out that there was no real proof linking the man to the robbery. However, the others were convinced. They believed that the gold was hidden somewhere in the city, left untouched for years because the criminal's unexpected arrest and later fate had prevented him from reclaiming it. The conversation ended with the certainty that the treasure was still out there, waiting to be found by the right person. The conversation unfolded with a tense discussion about hidden gold, the protagonist listening carefully as the other man speculated on whether it had been buried in a backyard. Many had hoarded gold during those times, waiting for price controls to lift, and now the search was on. The protagonist was approached because of his reputation for finding things, but he wasn't convinced. When offered a third of the fortune, amounting to millions, he considered the risks. If the gold wasn't real, then a third of nothing meant nothing. Curious about why he was chosen, he asked what their first steps would be. Given the case's age, witnesses were likely gone, leaving only historical records, police reports, and newspaper articles. His question was met with a surprising turn. The other man already seemed well-versed in the matter, suggesting deeper knowledge. But there was another problem. Two men in a blue vehicle were watching them. The protagonist pointed them out, and the others reacted with unease. They had been followed for a week. Attempts to confront the strangers had failed. They always drove off only to reappear again. The realization struck. These men were after the gold too, waiting for someone else to find it first. The protagonist pressed for answers. Had they told anyone? A friend? Family? Someone connected to their research? The denials were firm, yet the watchers remained, their presence proving otherwise. The situation was more dangerous than it seemed. The real request wasn't just for help finding the gold, it was for protection. The protagonist saw through their hesitation. Ivy, the young woman beside him, reached out with a pleading touch. There was trust in her eyes, a connection deeper than the treasure hunt. He was the one she relied on when no one else could help. That realization weighed on him. Despite his doubts, the pressure in the air was undeniable. Something bigger was at play. With a sigh, he gave in. "Sure," he said. The relief on their faces told him one thing. This was going to be far more complicated than just a treasure hunt. The protagonist sat with two young individuals, questioning if they were old enough to drink. They seemed offended but quickly shifted the conversation to a place called Ricky's. The protagonist instructed them to wait 5 minutes before heading to their car and driving south. Their route didn't matter as long as they ended up at Ricky's. When asked about his plan, he made it clear. He needed to confirm if the men in the Trailblazer were indeed following them and find out who they were. The young woman seemed intrigued, even asking if he planned to shoot them. The protagonist assured them that no guns would be involved, though they didn't seem convinced. Before parting ways, there was a moment of nostalgia between him and the young woman, a shared memory bringing a smile to her face. As the protagonist left the coffee house, the men in the Trailblazer didn't notice him. He relocated his car and kept watch, waiting for the right moment. Soon, the Trailblazer followed a blue Honda Civic. Adjusting his side mirror, he confirmed that the young pair was inside the Civic, and then he tailed the Chevy from behind. Years of working in law enforcement had earned him many connections, especially at the St. Paul Police Department. However, asking for favors came with risks. Using police resources for personal matters was against policy. Instead, he followed a method used by a private investigator he knew, paying informants discreetly for information. He called one now a sergeant in the Minneapolis gang unit. Their exchange was brief. The sergeant knew exactly why he was calling and didn't bother with pleasantries. The protagonist provided the Chevy's license plate, and in return, the sergeant promised to get back to him. Meanwhile, the young pair continued along the instructed route, passing notable locations. The sergeant soon called back, revealing details about the driver, a young man, only 22, with no outstanding warrants but a legal permit to carry a weapon. The sergeant warned him, saying many young men like this were eager to use their firearms. The protagonist understood the risk and thanked him, ensuring payment would be made. Realizing their pursuit was becoming too obvious, he decided to break away. Rather than following them all the way, he took a different route and headed straight to Ricky's, preparing for whatever would come next. The protagonist arrived at the club and spotted two familiar cars parked outside. After parking his own car between them, he stepped inside. The place had an elegant dining room for jazz performances upstairs and a cozy bar downstairs, where music mostly played from CDs. As he walked in, a woman behind the bar greeted him by name. She asked if he was there to see another woman, but he brushed off the question. saying he had things to do. She arched an eyebrow, clearly skeptical, but moved on, offering him his usual beer, which he accepted. While waiting, he scanned the room and immediately noticed two men at a table near the stage. Their expressions and the way they watched him made their intentions obvious. Another pair, one of whom matched a description he had been given, sat near the door. They looked younger than expected, drinking light beer without glasses, trying too hard to seem tough. The way they occasionally glanced at the first two men without making eye contact made them look inexperienced. Both wore windbreakers despite the warm temperature, likely concealing weapons. When his drink arrived, he ignored it and stood up, catching the bartender's concerned look. She asked what he was planning, but he reassured her, though she didn't seem convinced. He walked toward the pair near the door, loudly addressing one by a random name, pretending they were old friends. The man was confused, exchanging glances with his companion. The protagonist continued playing along, acting overly friendly and making sarcastic remarks. His comments irritated the second man, who snapped back aggressively. The protagonist remained calm, leaning in close and lowering his voice. He warned them that they needed to stop following his friends. If they didn't, there would be consequences. He made it clear that this was their only chance to walk away peacefully. One of them, clearly agitated, pushed back his chair and revealed a gun under his windbreaker, taunting the protagonist. Instead of reacting, the protagonist played along, pretending to be scared in a sarcastic tone. The man gripped his gun, watching for a reaction, but the protagonist remained still, unfazed. As tension filled the air, he turned to the first man and asked if his partner was really going to pull a gun on him, leaving the situation hanging in suspense. The moment was tense, and the protagonist wasn't about to back down. One of the men, clearly trying to intimidate, made a snide remark. Without hesitation, the protagonist struck, driving an elbow straight into the man's nose. The impact was brutal, snapping the cartilage and causing blood to pour out. The man immediately forgot about his gun, clutching his face in pain. Taking advantage of the moment, the protagonist swiftly grabbed the weapon, a snub-nosed .38, and emptied its 5 cartridges onto the table. With a sharp remark about the difference between showing a gun and actually using one, the protagonist set the empty weapon down. Despite the dramatic display, the second man across the table didn't flinch. His posture shifted, rigid, calculated, his expression darkening with unspoken thoughts. His breathing quickened, revealing growing aggression. When he finally spoke, his voice carried an unsettling threat. The protagonist realized that the situation was slipping out of control. The second man slowly moved his hand toward his hip, clearly considering his next move. Rather than escalating things further, the protagonist chose a different approach: distraction. Casually, he asked about the man's age, his schooling, and whether his vehicle was fully paid off. The unexpected questions caused momentary confusion. Then, shifting the focus to the real issue, the protagonist suggested that the man should reconsider his position. Surely, he wasn't watching people for free. He had a boss, right? And with things changing, maybe he should ask for a raise. The man hesitated, his uncertain response revealing cracks in his confidence. Meanwhile, the injured man, still clutching his broken nose, whined about the pain. The protagonist dismissed his complaints, sarcastically claiming that the injury would make him look more rugged. This only angered the man further, leading to a childish back and forth of threats and denials. At that moment, the protagonist caught the attention of a woman working nearby. She approached, but her pace quickened when she noticed the blood. Without missing a beat, the protagonist pointed out that the establishment had a strict no-gun policy. The woman, recognizing the serious nature of the situation, didn't hesitate. With firm authority, she demanded that the armed man leave immediately. When he refused, she pulled out her phone, ready to call the police. Realizing they had no choice, the two men finally backed down. They stood, though not without a final warning. The second man promised that he wouldn't forget this, his tone filled with lingering menace. The injured man hurried to reclaim his gun, but the protagonist ordered him to leave the bullets behind. Though he clearly wanted to protest, his partner's sharp motion signaled for him to drop it. Reluctantly, they left. Once they were gone, the woman turned on the protagonist. Grabbing his arm, she demanded to know if he had really just punched a customer. The protagonist's response was unapologetic, playfully suggesting that she had probably wanted to do the same at some point. Exasperated, she clutched her head in frustration, her emotions spilling over in an almost comedic display. The atmosphere was tense after the earlier confrontation. A woman warned that pressing charges was a possibility, but the protagonist dismissed the idea, saying that the man he had hit might try to get revenge but wouldn't go to the police. There were unspoken rules among people like him. Another woman, who seemed frustrated, turned and walked away toward an office with clear intentions of reporting what had happened. The protagonist then joined two people at a table. One of them, a cheerful young woman, admired how he had handled the situation, calling it impressive. However, he brushed off her praise, admitting that what he had done wasn't cool but rather an impulsive reaction to prove a point. She seemed disappointed, but the other person at the table, a more serious man, looked at him with newfound respect. The conversation quickly shifted to the real problem at hand. The protagonist speculated that the two men they had encountered earlier were spies sent by someone powerful. Their goal was either to find the hidden treasure first or steal it once it was discovered. When asked who these men were working for, the serious man hesitated, claiming he didn't know. The protagonist didn't believe him but decided not to press the issue. He warned them that the spies wouldn't back off. If anything, they would become more cautious, keeping a greater distance while continuing to watch. Their employer might even try to negotiate instead of using force. The young woman wanted reassurance that the protagonist wouldn't make a deal with them. He firmly stated that he already had an agreement with them. If the treasure was real, he intended to claim his rightful share, not just for himself, but because he had already invested so much. More importantly, he wanted the money to buy something special for his girlfriend, hoping to make up for upsetting her. At that moment, the protagonist noticed his girlfriend standing nearby, arms crossed, her piercing gaze locked onto him with suspicion. He tried to play it off with a casual remark, but she remained silent. When he invited her to join them, she didn't budge. Instead, she watched closely as he gave final instructions to his companions, telling them to call if they spotted the spies again. Their next step was to investigate people connected to the past heist, looking into police records for clues. As the two companions left, the protagonist turned back to his girlfriend with a smile, but she was not amused. She confronted him about his recent actions, saying she had heard about him attacking one of her customers. He tried to downplay it, insisting that the man was armed, but she was unimpressed. Their agreement had been clear. He wasn't supposed to bring trouble into her place. She was visibly upset, accusing him of putting her at risk. He attempted to apologize, but she cut him off, demanding to know what trouble he was wrapped up in this time. He joked about her suspicious nature, but she wasn't in the mood for humor. Eventually, she sat down, arms still folded, as she continued to question him. She saw right through him. He was helping those young people. With a pointed remark, she noted that the red-haired girl was quite pretty. The protagonist smoothly replied that, given enough time, she might become half as beautiful as his girlfriend. That response seemed to soften her mood, if only for a brief moment. The protagonist apologized for breaking someone's nose, insisting it wasn't intentional and wouldn't happen again. The woman beside him sighed, already used to the trouble that seemed to follow him. She wished he had a safer way of spending his time, but he assured her this time was different. He wasn't chasing justice. Instead, he was searching for buried treasure. She was skeptical at first, but as he explained, his own excitement grew. Even though it seemed unlikely, the idea of finding Jelly's gold fascinated him. She listened intently and then smiled, acknowledging the possibility that the treasure could be real. The protagonist admired her deeply, her intelligence, resilience, and beauty. She had built a business from nothing while raising a daughter alone after her husband left. They had talked about marriage, but she had no intention of repeating past mistakes. He accepted it, though he couldn't imagine a future without her. He clarified that the treasure hunt wasn't about money. He already had $5 million he never intended to spend. It was about the thrill of the search, of discovering something no one else could. She saw the excitement in his eyes and knew nothing would stop him. She told him to leave and enjoy himself since he was too distracted to be of any use to her that night. He kissed her briefly before heading out. Later, he spent hours researching Frank Nash, scouring FBI records, news archives, and old reports. The more he read, the clearer the man's past became. Back in 1933, Frank Nash stood in front of a hotel mirror, frowning at his growing belly. His nickname, Jelly, once came from his skill with explosives, but now it seemed to describe his appearance. He called out to the woman in the next room, but she stayed silent. She had been angry since they left St. Paul, still struggling with the truth about his criminal past. She had once believed he was a successful businessman, but the wealth and luxury they enjoyed had come from a different source. She had once been a poor cook, working hard to support herself and her daughter after an abusive marriage. Frank had given her a new life, but constantly being on the run took its toll. She flinched at loud noises, peering out windows whenever a car door slammed. Their recent visit to St. Paul had made things worse. Frank had met with dangerous criminals, ruthless men who respected his intelligence. They hung onto his every word, fascinated by his past, especially his legendary prison escape. Frank had built a reputation as a master criminal, managing to escape conviction multiple times despite numerous arrests for burglary. Even when sentenced to life in prison for murder in 1913, he talked his way into a pardon. Over the years, he continued his crime spree, receiving multiple prison sentences for burglary and robbery, yet he always found a way to secure his freedom. In 1924, after another conviction, he orchestrated a daring prison break, helping several notorious criminals escape before slipping away himself. As he gained notoriety, other criminals sought his approval. A group, eager to impress him, shared their bold plan to kidnap a wealthy businessman for ransom. Frank, however, saw the danger in their ambition and decided to leave town before trouble caught up to him. Meanwhile, his companion, a woman who had been by his side for years, was increasingly uncomfortable with the people he surrounded himself with. She despised the violent men he associated with and how they treated women. She made it clear she wanted nothing to do with them. Frank, attempting to defend himself, asked if he had ever treated her poorly. Her long silence spoke volumes, and he quickly dropped the subject. Despite his criminal success, age was catching up with him. As he fixed his red toupee in the mirror, he barely recognized himself. The years of crime and stress had taken a heavy toll, and he had started drinking heavily. For the first time, he wondered if it was time to leave this life behind. Later, while his companion sat reading, Frank decided to step out for cigarettes. She barely acknowledged him, lost in thought. As he left the hotel, he was unaware of the three men in the lobby who set down their newspapers and quietly followed him. He walked into a cigar store, casually browsing while waiting for his purchase. He felt secure, knowing that criminals like him were generally safe in hot springs as long as they followed certain unwritten rules. However, his confidence shattered when he felt a firm hand on his shoulder. A low voice greeted him by name. Turning, he found three men in dark suits staring at him. He attempted to feign ignorance, introducing himself as George Miller, but the lead man flashed his credentials, an FBI agent. Beside him stood another agent and a police chief who had clearly traveled far to find him. Frank, realizing he had been caught, remained composed. He acknowledged their presence with a smirk, remarking on how far they had come just for him. The police chief, unwavering, simply responded that it was no trouble at all. Frank had barely settled in when trouble found him. The men he once helped, two gunmen he had busted out of prison, had turned on him, spilling everything to the authorities. That betrayal led to his capture, and now, standing before his captors, he tried to maintain his usual charm. One of the agents mocked his nickname, calling him the Gentleman Bandit. Frank, ever the smooth talker, played along, insisting that there was no reason to be uncivil. But the weight of his situation was undeniable. He was cuffed, led out of the store, and paraded through the streets like a prize catch. An old acquaintance watched from a distance. The man had known Frank for years, sharing high-stakes poker tables and good times. When he saw Frank being escorted to a waiting car, he realized the authorities weren't bothering to involve the local police. This was a federal operation. Concerned, he rushed to inform someone close to Frank, who wasted no time making a call. The number had been given to her for emergencies, and now was the time to use it. On the other end of the line, a man known as Doc listened carefully before assuring her not to worry. Moments later, word spread through the underworld. Frank had been taken by the feds. Meanwhile, in Kansas City, the train station buzzed with activity. Amid the crowd, a woman working behind a desk took notice of an unusual group of men. They stood in a loose formation, their eyes scanning the area with sharp intent. What truly caught her attention, however, were the shotguns they carried. Soon, an agent emerged from the train, speaking briefly with the leader of the group, a high-ranking official. Beside him were trusted agents and two reliable police detectives, a rare find in a city plagued by corruption. A few minutes later, more men arrived, escorting a prisoner in handcuffs. As they passed the woman's desk, she took note of the only man smiling in the group. That smile didn't sit well with his captors. Frank had remained annoyingly cheerful throughout the journey, from the breakneck drive out of Hot Springs to the quiet train ride en route to Kansas City. When he asked where they were taking him, the answer was clear: Leavenworth Penitentiary. His past crimes had finally caught up with him. But even then, he remained unfazed, simply remarking that he had been to Leavenworth before and didn't expect to stay long. Frank had barely settled in when trouble found him. The men he once helped, two gunmen he had busted out of prison, had turned on him, spilling everything to the authorities. That betrayal led to his capture, and now, standing before his captors, he tried to maintain his usual charm. One of the agents mocked his nickname, calling him the Gentleman Bandit. Frank, ever the smooth talker, played along, insisting that there was no reason to be uncivil. But the weight of his situation was undeniable. He was cuffed, led out of the store, and paraded through the streets like a prize catch. An old acquaintance watched from a distance. The man had known Frank for years, sharing high-stakes poker tables and good times. When he saw Frank being escorted to a waiting car, he realized the authorities weren't bothering to involve the local police. This was a federal operation. Concerned, he rushed to inform someone close to Frank, who wasted no time making a call. The number had been given to her for emergencies, and now was the time to use it. On the other end of the line, a man known as Doc listened carefully before assuring her not to worry. Moments later, word spread through the underworld: Frank had been taken by the feds. Meanwhile, in Kansas City, the train station buzzed with activity. Amid the crowd, a woman working behind a desk took notice of an unusual group of men. They stood in a loose formation, their eyes scanning the area with sharp intent. What truly caught her attention, however, were the shotguns they carried. Soon, an agent emerged from the train, speaking briefly with the leader of the group, a high-ranking official. Beside him were trusted agents and two reliable police detectives, a rare find in a city plagued by corruption. A few minutes later, more men arrived, escorting a prisoner in handcuffs. As they passed the woman's desk, she took note of the only man smiling in the group. That smile didn't sit well with his captors. Frank had remained annoyingly cheerful throughout the journey, from the breakneck drive out of Hot Springs to the quiet train ride en route to Kansas City. When he asked where they were taking him, the answer was clear: Leavenworth Penitentiary. His past crimes had finally caught up with him. But even then, he remained unfazed, simply remarking that he had been to Leavenworth before and didn't expect to stay long. The lawmen and their prisoner stepped into the bright sunlight, pausing briefly as the man in handcuffs lifted his hands to shield his eyes. With no immediate threats in sight, they cautiously moved toward the waiting vehicles, a new Chevrolet and an older Dodge, parked in front of the station. One of the agents owned the Chevy and wasted no time pushing the prisoner into the front seat. 3 others settled into the back, while more officers positioned themselves between the 2 cars, ready to escort the Chevy to its destination. Just as the agent reached for the driver's door, a powerful voice shattered the tense calm. Up, get him up. Chaos erupted as 2 armed men sprinted toward the car from behind, while 3 more emerged in front, their machine guns aimed with deadly intent. A heavy-set man, perched on the running board of a green Plymouth, had his weapon locked onto the officers. His identity would remain a topic of debate for years, but there was no question about at least one of the attackers, an infamous figure with a reputation that made men both fear and admire him. The prisoner recognized him instantly, a man who once scolded him for drinking too much. They had been alike in many ways, sharing a code of honor even in their criminal world, both meticulous in their planning, both respectful toward women, and neither one inclined toward unnecessary violence. But while the prisoner was known for daring heists, his old acquaintance had built his name as a feared and highly sought-after hitman, working with the most notorious gangs across the country. For a brief moment, the prisoner might have believed he was about to be saved. Then, everything unraveled. One of the officers, reacting instinctively, pulled his pistol and fired, hitting the heavy-set man in the arm. That single shot shattered any chance of a peaceful standoff. "Let 'em have it," the wounded man roared, unleashing a storm of gunfire. The street turned into a battlefield. 2 officers fell instantly, their bodies crumpling under the relentless barrage. Another was shot in the arm and dove for cover under a car. The agent who had been reaching for the driver's door was struck in the head, collapsing lifelessly to the ground. Inside the car, another officer was riddled with bullets before he could even draw his weapon. Another man took 3 shots to the spine, slumping onto a fellow officer, who, by some miracle, remained untouched. The prisoner watched in horror as blood painted the scene around him. He turned to the gunman, disbelief in his eyes. "Have you lost your mind?" he shouted, but his voice was lost in the storm of bullets. The Chevy was being shredded by machine gun fire. Desperate, the prisoner flailed his cuffed hands, trying to signal, "For mercy's sake, don't shoot me." The plea fell on deaf ears. A moment later, the attack left his body motionless, his life stolen by the very chaos he had hoped would free him. Nearby, a woman who had witnessed the horror let out a terrified scream. "They're killing everyone." An officer patrolling the station came running, gun in hand. Confusion clouded his mind. Who were the attackers? Who was the target? The woman's frantic voice cut through the chaos. "Shoot the fat man. It's pretty boy Floyd." The officer took aim and fired. The heavy-set man staggered but did not fall, still gripping his weapon as he returned fire. Whether the shot had hit him or if he had merely dodged, no one could tell. As the dust began to settle, one of the gunmen checked inside the Chevy. "They're all dead," he declared. Yet one man remained frozen in place, staring at the blood-smeared windshield where his friend had just been sitting. For a moment, he didn't move, as if time itself had stopped. Then, a fellow gunman grabbed his arm. "Let's go." The killers fled, piling into waiting cars that roared out of the lot, disappearing into the city streets. Later, the woman who had witnessed it all would struggle to believe what had just happened. It had felt like an eternity, but in reality, the massacre had lasted less than 30 seconds. The protagonist had spent considerable time researching the fate of various criminals linked to past events. One by one, those involved met their end. Some were gunned down, others arrested, and a few vanished into obscurity. A woman tried to escape her past, but law enforcement never let her forget, constantly questioning her whenever a crime occurred. Meanwhile, a man on the run attempted to flee overseas with his partner, but both law enforcement and the criminal underworld were after him. The brutal massacre that had shocked the public had changed everything. Before, gangsters were seen as rebellious figures striking back at the system, but the ruthless killing of officers turned public sentiment against them. The government seized this moment, giving law enforcement unprecedented authority to pursue criminals without jurisdictional limits. Eventually, the hunted man was found dead, his body severely beaten and mutilated. The FBI could only identify him through fingerprints. Yet, despite all the research and reports, there was no mention of the legendary gold that had supposedly been stolen. Frustrated but unwilling to give up, the protagonist decided to dig deeper and headed to the police department for more information. At the St. Paul Police Department, the protagonist noticed an old plaque listing names of past officials. One name stood out, a connection to someone who had once partied with the infamous thief suspected of stealing the gold. This discovery fueled the determination to continue the investigation. However, when inquiring about old police records, the protagonist was met with disappointment. A staff member, speaking with slow exasperation, explained that all records from the 1920s and 1930s had been lost during a renovation decades ago. The files had been thrown away, erasing crucial history, including reports on notorious criminals and corrupt officials. The protagonist found it hard to believe that so much valuable information had simply been discarded. Every detail, wiretaps, surveillance reports, and evidence of corruption was gone. Even an official history book barely acknowledged the gangster era, reducing it to a minor anecdote. Despite the dead ends, the protagonist wasn't ready to give up just yet. The protagonist was inquiring about old case files, but the clerk dismissed their importance, explaining they had been shredded when the department switched to a digital system. While it could be seen as an attempt to erase embarrassing ties to criminals, the protagonist knew that wasn't the case. The police weren't the only ones eager to rewrite history. Wealthy, well-known figures also had reasons to bury the past. Still, the protagonist couldn't shake the feeling that something was being hidden. The clerk suggested checking the Minnesota Historical Society, but then had another idea: homicide files. Unlike other records, murder cases had no statute of limitations. Given a red access card, the protagonist was meant to visit the records unit on the 3rd floor but instead took the elevator down to the homicide unit. There, a receptionist, sleek and confident, greeted them warmly. The protagonist's playful remark was met with an amused smile, but the moment was interrupted when another officer arrived. Recognizing the protagonist instantly, she reacted with mild surprise, making it clear that their reputation still followed them. The protagonist had once been a well-respected cop, even earning an Officer of the Year title. But most knew them for something else: the former officer who walked away from the force with a $3 million reward for tracking an embezzler. Some admired them, while others saw them as someone who had sold out. That reputation lingered, and the protagonist couldn't be sure where this detective stood. Asking for Lieutenant Dunstan, they were met with humor. He had likely avoided them on purpose. The detective led the protagonist into the homicide unit, a place that looked like any ordinary office but with an unmistakable air of authority. The protagonist greeted her casually, but she quickly turned serious when they requested access to old files. She immediately refused, knowing her superior would be furious. The protagonist insisted they weren't looking for current or cold cases, just records from 1930 to 1933. That caught her off guard. She could hardly believe what she was hearing. The protagonist sat across from a woman at her desk, the morning light casting a glow on her tangled hair. She studied him carefully, already suspicious of his intentions. When she asked what he was up to, he considered telling her the truth but decided against it. Too many people already knew about Jelly's gold, and secrecy was becoming crucial. Instead, he reassured her that he wasn't doing anything illegal. She wasn't convinced, but when he explained that he was researching old gangsters for a friend, a university literature major, she finally relented. Leading him to a collection of old police records, she let him dig through the dusty boxes. As he sifted through reports, he found numerous cases of homicides linked to gangsters in the 1930s. The records detailed crimes involving notorious criminals, from mobsters gunned down near White Bear Lake to bank robbers killed during heists. However, none of it directly connected to Frank Nash, the man he was hoping to learn more about. Just as frustration set in, he stumbled upon something that made his hands tremble. An old surveillance report mentioned that the police had been watching an auto dealership suspected of supplying heavily armored getaway cars to criminals. These cars came with police radios and quick-release bolts for switching license plates. Law enforcement had hoped to track down a dangerous hitman but instead discovered something else: a sighting of Frank "Jelly" Nash. The report stated that on June 6, 1933, Nash had returned a 1932 Oldsmobile Series F Roadster that he had leased 3 days prior. What made this significant was that the car had been specially reinforced to carry a heavy load, up to 1,000 extra pounds. The vehicle had been returned on June 8, the exact same day as a major gold heist in South Dakota. Realizing the implications, the protagonist quickly borrowed the woman's computer to check the weight of a gold bar. After some calculations, he found that the added weight in Nash's car could have been consistent with 32 bars of gold. The conclusion was undeniable: Nash had likely been the mastermind behind the heist. Overcome with excitement, he spun around, grabbed the woman's face, and kissed her. She responded with a sarcastic remark, but the protagonist was too exhilarated to care. Still riding the adrenaline rush, he got into his car, dialing his phone as he drove. His contact on the other end, who had been trying to convince him of this theory, now felt vindicated. When asked what he planned to do next, the protagonist simply stated that he was heading to the Minnesota History Center. While the official records on Nash might be exhausted, there was still one angle left to explore: who had helped him move the stolen gold? The protagonist exchanged thoughts with a determined individual about the connection between major crimes and wealthy figures pulling the strings. While the other person planned to investigate personal collections for letters and diaries, the protagonist remained focused on more immediate concerns, like the men who had been following them. A glance in the rearview mirror revealed that they hadn't disappeared. A red Chevy Aveo was still on their trail. Navigating the streets of St. Paul, the protagonist headed toward the Minnesota History Center, a grand building overlooking the city. The journey was filled with stoplights and turns, making it easy to confirm that the red Aveo had been following since the morning. The occupants of the car remained unclear, but the protagonist had a strong suspicion about their identities. Instead of shaking them off, they decided to play along, pretending not to notice while leading them toward the History Center's parking lot. The Aveo parked at the bottom while the protagonist took a spot near the entrance, deliberately ignoring the pursuers as they made their way inside. Inside the research library, the protagonist spotted a striking woman with blue eyes, a classic Nordic beauty, sitting nearby, engrossed in historical documents. Normally, they would have acknowledged her with a polite smile, but something else captured their attention. A treasure trove of 1930s records. The collection, donated by a historian, was a goldmine of books, articles, diaries, and even an unpublished manuscript detailing the city's past. St. Paul in those days was a tight-knit world where everyone seemed to be connected, especially those who held power and influence. As the protagonists immersed themselves in the historical accounts, the weight of the past intertwined with their present investigation, uncovering secrets that had been buried for decades. O'Connor sat there, his mind clouded with thoughts. Age had started to slow him down, though he wouldn't admit it. His personal life was a mess. He had married one woman, but his affair with another had led to a secret daughter. When his wife found out, she took their daughter and left, offering divorce. Desperate to keep his life intact, he paid her off, but when she passed away unexpectedly, he had no choice but to marry the other woman. Now, he was already scheming to send her away so he could be with someone else. Amidst these tangled personal troubles, a young man barged in, bringing news that was already splashed across the headlines. Dan Hogan was dead. The young man, panicked, demanded action. But O'Connor, once a powerful figure known as the Cardinal, was done. He had left that life behind. However, the city's elite, the powerful men who had once relied on him, weren't ready to let him go. Wealthy businessmen and influential leaders, all of whom had profited from the system he had built, feared its collapse. They needed him, but he no longer needed them. He was rich, old, and retired. O'Connor had once been a simple city clerk, but over time, he gathered secrets, scandals, weaknesses, and hidden deals of the city's most powerful men. Using this knowledge, he introduced corruption into the government, climbing higher until he controlled the entire system. Even the greatest figures like railroad tycoon James J. Hill sought his advice. When Hill disagreed with him on politics, O'Connor simply walked away, knowing he held the real power. In the end, he played both sides, manipulating elections just because he could. O'Connor leaned back, a smirk crossing his face as he recalled his past. He had always relished his role as the one pulling the strings, ensuring that his city, his domain, was firmly under his control. Every major position in the city was filled with people loyal to him, and his brother had been chief of police for nearly 2 decades. But power came with a price. Anyone doing business in the city had to pay up, corporations, contractors, and individuals alike. Fees started at $2,500, while department heads, honorary board members, and breweries all had their own financial obligations. The breweries, in particular, had to supply free beer and rally their workers behind any cause O'Connor deemed important. Beyond politics, O'Connor expanded his influence through various ventures. He founded a jockey club, controlled horse races, ran illegal gambling operations, and even took a percentage of every dollar earned from the city's saloons, gambling dens, and other questionable establishments. This money trickled down into the hands of detectives, judges, and city officials, ensuring the system remained intact. But criminals weren't given free rein. A strict layover agreement was enforced. Outsiders had to report to the chief, pay a bribe, and promise not to commit crimes within the city. If anyone broke the rules, they would face swift and brutal consequences, not from the police, but from fellow criminals who ensured order was maintained. Because of this, St. Paul became a paradox, one of the safest cities in America, yet a haven for the underworld. However, this arrangement didn't extend beyond city limits. Criminals operating under O'Connor's protection had no hesitation about targeting neighboring towns. The Minnesota Bankers Association later reported that a shocking number of bank robberies in the U.S. took place in the state, but as long as St. Paul remained untouched, O'Connor turned a blind eye. The network relied on intermediaries to keep things running smoothly. Originally, a man named Billy Griffin had acted as the go-between, but after his death, the responsibility fell to Dapper Dan Hogan. Now, with Hogan murdered, a dangerous vacuum had formed. He hadn't just been a mediator. He had been the most skilled fence in the city, able to launder massive amounts of stolen money. Criminals depended on him to move stolen bonds, and without him, the system was on the verge of collapse. A young man stepped forward, speaking carefully. If O'Connor didn't act, he warned, someone else would. That someone was a bootlegger named Leon Gleckman, a reckless man, untrustworthy, and now openly announcing his plan to run for mayor. O'Connor chuckled at the idea. He had seen many mayors come and go, and Gleckman wouldn't be out of place among them. But the young man pressed on, making it clear, if nothing was done, the system that had kept them all rich and powerful would crumble. Reformers would seize control and no one would be safe. O'Connor recognized a threat when he heard one. With a knowing smile, he simply replied, "I'm retired." Meanwhile, a separate line of investigation continued. A determined figure dug deeper into the past, wondering where Nash might have hidden his stolen gold. With Hogan dead, would he have trusted Gleckman? It seemed unlikely. Nash was a careful man, not one to work with someone as reckless as Gleckman. Other names surfaced: a club owner who had taken over Hogan's operations, a casino owner connected to notorious criminals, and a gambling tycoon linked to key figures on the night of the infamous gold heist. None of them seemed trustworthy, but Nash had a history of keeping dangerous company. He had been close to a ruthless killer and had ties to a notorious crime family. If he had placed his gold anywhere, it was in the hands of someone just as cold and calculated as he was. The protagonist was deep in thought, trying to determine where the stolen gold might be hidden. The thief had learned about the shipment just before robbing the bank, which meant he might not have had time to sell it. Maybe it was still in his possession, but where? As the protagonist pondered this, a striking woman suddenly pulled out the chair across from him and sat down. She had the kind of beauty that seems straight out of a novel: bright eyes, golden hair, and a confident smile. Dressed in a fitted black skirt and a top that accentuated her athletic frame, she introduced herself as heavenly. Her presence was unusual. Women like her didn't often approach him, especially not in a library. She knew his name and even mentioned the names of some men he had recently encountered. It was clear she had been paying attention to him. Then, without hesitation, she made a request. She wanted him to stop researching the thief and return the files immediately. Instead, she invited him to meet her downstairs for coffee. Her sudden demand raised questions. What was her interest in this case? And why was she so determined to stop him? She attempted to use charm to sway him, but the protagonist wasn't so easily convinced. However, when she offered to buy him coffee, he agreed to meet her in 5 minutes. Downstairs, in a sleek, modern cafe, the protagonist waited as she brought their drinks, his black coffee and an indulgent dessert for herself. Despite her fit appearance, she admitted she exercised daily to balance out her love for sweets. Their conversation quickly shifted to serious matters. She bluntly accused him of working for a man she clearly despised, correcting herself when he said he was working with him, not for him. Her hostility extended to another woman involved in the case, but when the protagonist defended her, Heavenly backed off. It soon became clear why she was so invested in this. She had history with one of the men involved, a past relationship that still affected her. There was hesitation in her voice, a hint of unresolved emotions as she spoke of their time together at university. Her sudden change in demeanor, from confident to uncertain, hinted at something deeper. The protagonist couldn't ignore it. There was more to her involvement than she was letting on. The conversation between the protagonist and the determined woman took an intense turn as she revealed her deep involvement in the search for hidden gold. She had spent years researching an old bank robbery, uncovering lost records, and confirming that the treasure was still hidden. She believed she had found something truly valuable, but her former partner, driven by greed, betrayed her. He stole her findings and left her for another woman, shattering the trust she once had in him. Now, she was determined to reclaim what she believed was rightfully hers. The protagonist, however, remained skeptical, suggesting that possession mattered more than claims. The tension escalated when she subtly hinted at the presence of her associates watching from outside, a clear warning that she wasn't alone in this pursuit. But the protagonist remained unfazed, proving he was always one step ahead. Shifting tactics, the woman proposed a partnership, offering a share of the treasure. She even suggested there might be other incentives for cooperation. The protagonist, however, skillfully dismissed her advances with a playful but firm rejection, making it clear he wasn't easily swayed. Amused but undeterred, she warned him she would find the gold first, and he had better stay out of her way. The challenge was set, and both knew that this hunt was far from over. The woman laughed softly, grabbed her drink, and walked away, leaving the man watching as she swayed toward the door. He called out to her, warning her to keep her associates away when he left, but she simply shrugged and left without a care. He couldn't deny that she was an attractive woman, but there were more important matters to attend to. He returned upstairs to continue searching through the archives, determined to find information on the people who had helped transport a massive amount of gold. Despite his efforts, he couldn't uncover any names. Shifting his focus to addresses, he managed to find 6 before a librarian tapped him on the shoulder, signaling that it was time to leave. Gathering his notes, he exited the building and made a call. A woman on the other end invited him to the club, mentioning a special dinner prepared by a well-known chef. He dismissed the chef's reputation with a teasing remark, but that wasn't the real reason for his call. Instead, he proposed an adventure treasure hunting. The woman was immediately intrigued and agreed eagerly. Stepping outside, he noticed the sun still casting a warm glow despite the late hour. His gaze landed on a red car sitting conspicuously in the parking lot, its presence irritating him. It seemed the woman he had warned earlier didn't take him seriously. Considering confronting the people inside, he hesitated when he saw the gated exit. Realizing it wasn't worth the trouble, he decided to let it go. He climbed into his sleek silver car, appreciating its power compared to the unimpressive red vehicle. As he approached the exit booth, he handed a 20 to the elderly attendant, making a light-hearted comment about his formal attire. The attendant responded with a friendly remark, and after a brief exchange, the man drove out, leaving the red car trapped behind. The driver inside waved money in frustration, but he didn't look back. Speeding through the streets, he took several sharp turns, confident that the red car wouldn't be able to keep up. Reaching his destination, he and his companion stepped out, surveying the old apartment building. It resembled other structures nearby, but it was well maintained. They walked around, keeping a close watch for anyone following, but the woman's associates were nowhere in sight. When his companion asked what they were looking for, he didn't have a clear answer. Instead, he began recounting an old story, one that tied back to the very treasure they were after. Decades ago, 2 men greeted a third with excitement and disbelief. They were stunned to see him, amazed that he had escaped from a high-security prison. The escapee explained that he had hidden out in another city until he was assured it was safe to return. He had been staying in a hotel, unaware of the danger that still lurked around him. The man hesitated at first, not wanting to impose, but the 2 insisted, offering him a place in a well-furnished apartment. They reassured him it was quiet, affordable, and even had local kids willing to wash his car for a small fee. Despite his reservations, he eventually gave in. He moved into the Edgecombe Court apartments under a new identity, settling in despite his distaste for the way his new companions spoke. Surprisingly, he found himself enjoying the place, even forming a friendship with the owner, an elderly banker who took great pride in maintaining the building. Soon, he started earning well, working alongside the 2 men on several profitable ventures while also handling a few of his own. Life seemed good. He even fell in love with a woman from Minnesota, a talented cook who quickly became dear to him. Everything seemed to be falling into place until his partners were arrested. Worse, they betrayed him, giving up his name. Meanwhile, a conversation unfolded elsewhere. A man speculated about an old location, wondering if the gold could have been hidden there. The woman listening to him shook her head, doubtful. He insisted that the place was familiar to the man they were discussing, but she pointed out a major flaw: there was no garage. If the man had returned his car early in the morning, he would have had to unload heavy gold bars in broad daylight in a busy neighborhood. It seemed nearly impossible. The only way would have been to disguise it as something else, but even that felt unlikely. Their search led them to a simple two-story house, now covered in blue vinyl. The area, known for its tangled streets, had a reputation for being intellectual and cultured due to the presence of multiple colleges. But not everyone viewed it that way. As they stood before the house, they debated whether its current residents knew its history. The woman believed they would be excited rather than horrified. After all, the public had once admired outlaws who bent the rules and escaped justice, at least for a while. The man gestured toward the house, explaining that it was where the couple had spent the night before leaving for another city. But he was certain this wasn't where the gold was hidden. He doubted the man would have trusted his dangerous old associates. He had only come to see the place. But why? The city had long operated under an unspoken rule. Criminals could exist as long as they kept their activities outside the city limits. But not everyone followed the system. A group of criminals, known for their reckless disregard for rules, shattered this delicate balance. Their crime spree escalated quickly, starting with the high-profile kidnapping of a wealthy businessman, demanding a hefty ransom. Shockingly, even a former police chief played a role in the crime. Encouraged by their success, they kidnapped another prominent figure, a move that would prove to be their downfall. The second kidnapping outraged the city. Citizens who had once tolerated the criminal underworld turned against them. For the first time in decades, they supported reformers who were determined to clean up corruption. The wave of change was swift and brutal. Indictments were issued, corrupt officers were dismissed, and some were even jailed. One high-ranking official barely escaped prison due to legal technicalities, but his career was over. The purge didn't stop with law enforcement. City officials were also removed, reshaping the city's power structure. Despite the sweeping changes, some believed corruption hadn't disappeared. It had simply gone underground, hidden from the public eye. What was once an openly corrupt city had become one where secrecy was key. The search for answers led to a modest home that seemed far too small for a man known for hosting extravagant gatherings. This figure had taken over the criminal empire of a powerful predecessor, and some even suspected him of orchestrating his predecessor's demise. The question remained, could he have been trusted with something as valuable as hidden gold? If he had it, logic suggested he would have used it before his downfall. Another location, once a grand casino, held memories of a time when the city's elite and criminals mingled without fear. The lavish establishment had everything: fine dining, luxury drinks, and lively entertainment. It was a place where high-profile figures gathered, where deals were made in the shadows, and where a man known for his charm ruled the scene. He had friends in every circle, criminals, politicians, and law enforcers alike. To some, he was just a charismatic businessman, but others knew better. His wife, once a successful model, had given up her career for the thrill of life at his side. The excitement had been irresistible, but at what cost? The once lively Hollyhocks casino now stood empty, its grandeur fading into silence. No more lavish parties, no more expensive cars in the 16-car garage, and no more guests sipping drinks by the towering Greek columns while gazing at the Mississippi River. Instead, a woman wandered the abandoned place alone, following instructions from a letter she had received. She searched carefully, pressing on the wooden floorboards, listening for any sign of a hidden compartment. Her mind was clouded with memories, the weight of the past pressing down on her. The era of infamous gangsters had come to a brutal end. One by one, they were killed or imprisoned. Some met their fate in shootouts, others in failed escapes, and a few simply perished under suspicious circumstances. The woman had known them all, shared meals, and even welcomed them into the casino, once a hub for the elite and the outlaws alike. Yet now, she felt bitterness toward those in high society who had benefited from the chaos without facing any consequences. She was certain that the man she once cared for had been murdered. Despite his claims of being an ordinary citizen, authorities painted him as a manipulator, someone who connected criminals to corrupt officials and influential figures. Convicted for planning a high-profile kidnapping, he had been sentenced to 30 years in prison. The evidence against him was overwhelming, but she knew the truth. He had secrets about a massacre that could have changed everything. Before he could reveal them, he was found dead, supposedly by suicide. But the woman was convinced otherwise. Lost in thought, she suddenly felt the floor shift beneath her foot. A hollow sound echoed. Kneeling. She pried up a loose board, her heart pounding. Beneath it lay the promise he had left her, $25,000 in cash. It was enough to start over, to leave the past behind. Elsewhere, a conversation unfolded. A man spoke of the woman's story, emphasizing how much the deceased man had loved her. If he had the rumored gold, he would have left that for her too. His companion, a woman, questioned his devotion. "Would you have left me the gold?" she asked. "I would never have left you at all," he replied firmly. Their journey led them to Matamidi Avenue, where they parked near a row of old houses. Somewhere among them had once lived two people tied to the mystery of stolen gold. The man explained how the gangsters had used the area as a retreat, gambling, drinking, and hiding from the law. As they examined the houses, the woman pointed at a small red and yellow cottage, drawn to its charm. "I think they lived here," she said. The man smirked. "I doubt a gangster cared about cute, but his wife might have," she countered. She had a point. As they pieced together the past, another question arose. Had the couple lived here when the gold was stolen? So why had they stayed elsewhere later? The puzzle remained unsolved, but the deeper they dug, the closer they came to an answer that could change everything. The protagonist considered the possibility that the gold's owner had felt unsafe and left, but the woman pointed out that if that were true, he wouldn't have hidden the gold there in the first place. Frustration grew as they realized they were no closer to finding it. The woman admitted she had hoped it would be easier, but the protagonist reassured her and suggested they had one more stop to make. Arriving at Guardino's Italian restaurant, they climbed the concrete steps and entered through an old mesh screen door. Inside, the warm aroma of garlic, sausage, and marinara filled the air. The restaurant had a cozy, worn-out charm with wooden floors and walls adorned with photographs of Italian icons, including Frank Sinatra, Dean Martin, and Joe DiMaggio. One picture caught the protagonist's attention. It showed Tony Bennett standing with an elderly man in an apron outside the restaurant's entrance. A waitress approached, confirming that Tony Bennett had indeed dined there and revealing that the man in the photo was her grandfather, Joe. She laughed as she shared how her grandfather had played nothing but Tony Bennett's records for weeks after his visit. She then pointed out another photo, this one featuring Rosemary Clooney, and introduced herself as Rosemary Guardino, named after the famous singer. Curious about the restaurant's history, the woman mentioned that gangsters had also eaten there. Rosemary confirmed this, explaining that the area used to be a retreat for criminals staying in St. Paul. She listed notorious names like John Dillinger, Bugsy Siegel, and Machine Gun Kelly, which amused the protagonist. When the protagonist brought up Frank Nash, Rosemary confirmed that he had lived nearby with his wife, Frances, but she wasn't sure of the exact house. To help, she retrieved a photograph from the wall and handed it to them. The protagonist examined the image of Frank Nash alongside his elegant wife, whose eyes seemed to sparkle even in the old black and white picture. He then passed the photograph to the woman, their curiosity deepening as they searched for more clues. Seated in the booth, the protagonist listened as the woman explained the history behind a particular photograph. Her father had always claimed it was taken right here in the restaurant, back when he was just a boy. He remembered Frank Nash as a polite and well-mannered man, especially towards his family, which was why they took the picture. Other gangsters weren't given the same honor, perhaps because they weren't as nice. The conversation shifted to how the restaurant became tied to gangster lore. Decades ago, when a famous TV special aired about Al Capone's vault turning up empty, local media started investigating places linked to old-time gangsters. The restaurant was one of the few surviving establishments from that era, and the publicity brought wild rumors, claims of stolen money, hidden jewelry, and even buried bodies beneath the building. The idea of hidden gold came up, but the reality was less dramatic. When the family decided to renovate the basement and lay concrete, they dug up the dirt floor and, instead of treasure, discovered cases of aged bourbon buried since Prohibition. The whiskey became a sensation, with newspapers and TV stations revisiting the story. Rather than selling the bottles outright, the restaurant cleverly marketed the find, serving it by the glass as Al Capone's bourbon, a move that turned into a financial windfall. As the group ate their meals, their thoughts remained fixed on one thing: gold. They knew where it wasn't, at least not in the restaurant's basement. But then, a new clue emerged. The protagonist pointed out something about the photograph shown earlier, The woman standing beside Frank Nash wasn't his wife. Having seen other pictures of her, the protagonist was certain. The idea quickly took shape. If this unknown woman had a special connection with Frank, perhaps she knew where the gold was. Excitement grew as they speculated. Could this woman have been Frank's mistress? If so, had he entrusted his stolen fortune to her? The woman eagerly latched onto the theory, but the protagonist reminded her not to get ahead of herself. It was just a possibility, nothing more. Still, she found it thrilling. Compared to the dangers the protagonist usually faced, this was more like an adventure. They toasted to the moment, enjoying their wine, but their light-hearted mood shattered when the phone rang. On the other end, a panicked voice gasped the protagonist's name before delivering a chilling revelation. Someone had been murdered. A man named Josh had been shot, and from the horror in her voice, it was clear the crime was brutal. The easygoing evening had come to an abrupt and violent end. The call came through, and the protagonist listened as the distressed woman on the other end confirmed that the police were on their way. There was urgency in her voice, fear evident in every word. Hanging up, the protagonist stuffed the phone into a pocket and shared the grim news with the woman sitting across the booth. Someone had been murdered. The reaction was telling. She didn't seem shocked, just resigned, as if she had expected this all along. Arriving at the crime scene, the protagonist was stopped by an officer stationed at the entrance. The uniformed man checked the log of visitors, verifying identities before allowing entry. The protagonist explained the connection to the victim and the situation at hand. The officer relayed the information through his radio, while another officer nearby observed, his experience evident in the way he carried himself. The scene was relatively quiet for now, with only a few curious neighbors drawn in by the flashing lights. But that peace wouldn't last. As soon as a news van arrived, everything changed. A well-dressed reporter stepped out, immediately attracting attention. People called her name, waved, eager to be acknowledged. She barely reacted, her mind focused elsewhere. One of the officers muttered about her reputation on television, making an offhand comment about her appearance. The protagonist noted the observation but was more interested in the situation at hand. Checking the time, it became clear that the reporter wouldn't be able to do a live segment just yet. That might actually work in everyone's favor. It would give her time to report the facts instead of rushing to make the evening broadcast. With clearance granted, the protagonist stepped under the yellow crime scene tape. The officer handling the entry log recorded the name carefully, letter by letter, ensuring accuracy. Another officer recognized the protagonist from a past case, recalling an incident that had turned out to be quite profitable. They exchanged a few words, the officer joking about wishing he had connections like that. It was lighthearted, but the moment quickly turned serious again. The lieutenant had given clear instructions. Under no circumstances was the protagonist to touch anything. The officer assigned to escort duty made sure those orders were understood before leading the way. Just as they moved forward, the reporter seized her chance. She approached quickly, microphone in hand, camera operator following close behind. Another officer stepped in to block her, smiling as he did. It was obvious he enjoyed the attention, and the protagonist had no doubt he would be more than happy to talk if given the chance. The building was 3 stories high, and they took the stairs up. But as soon as they reached the second floor, the protagonist stopped cold. The body was right there, slumped against the wall, lifeless. The bullet wound below the right eye was unmistakable. The sight of it sent a wave of nausea through the protagonist, making it hard to move. Forcing in deep breaths, trying to steady shaky nerves, it took a moment to regain composure. The officer noticed the hesitation, his expression unreadable, though it was clear he was wondering about the reaction. A quiet admission followed. It had been a long time since the protagonist had seen something like this. The ability to process it had faded. The officer nodded in understanding, though there was an unspoken thought lingering between them. Would this make its way into conversation later? A quiet remark about how the ex-cop had lost his edge?